Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. The following story is actually a prequel to the Timepiece. The Timepiece was actually the second episode we ever aired on the Untold Tales podcast. So we are very excited about this episode, which will teach you a little bit more about how the Timepiece was created. The Timepiece continues to be one of the most popular episodes on this podcast. So if you want to stop and go back to episode 2 before you listen to this one, it'll be even more of an exciting storytelling adventure. Enjoy. Creating the Timepiece. Paul White made his discovery while working after hours at the prestigious Los Alamos laboratories. His department lab was in the Material Science and Technology Division. Paul preferred to work late, principally because he was the odd man out in the department. His colleagues were experts in other disciplines like solid-state physics, metallurgy, biomaterials, or nanotechnology. His expertise, however, was quantum chromodynamics, which examined deviations from the uniform flow of time. It was so different that none of his teammates really understood what he did. Everyone had their own specialties. Indeed, some were the foremost in their fields, but no one that Paul worked with really understood his areas of expertise. He, therefore, felt like an outsider most of the time. Still, he enjoyed his work, even though he usually had to work alone. For the past several months, his entire department had been researching a new material that had been discovered by a sister department in the High-Energy Physics Division. It was a photonic liquid crystal called Photonic Chromium-Based Liquid Crystal 20, or PCLC-20 for short. This particular material consisted of chiral nematic liquid crystal that slowed down light that passed through it to a billionth of its normal speed in a vacuum. No one quite understood how the material achieved this, but the Material Science Department had been tasked with examining what other properties the substance possessed and investigating potential applications. Despite weeks of effort, little had been discovered except that in certain polarized states, the liquid crystal matrix appeared denser than any known substance, that the material delayed electrical signals through it as well, giving it a ridiculously high resistance without generating any heat. 2 engineers were trying to create new types of photonic switches, but no one had yet found any practical uses for any of their discoveries. Paul, of course, focused on the temporal aspects of the substance, and this evening he had been measuring the delays of electrical signals sent through the material. However, one experiment that night had very unexpected results. When he sent a modulated pulse of electricity through the tiny liquid crystal matrix, he found he had somehow jumped backward about 10 minutes in time. The time on the clock had changed from 11:12 p.m. to 8:02. He blinked in surprise when it happened, thinking he had simply misread the clock he was using to log the times of his different tests. But when he repeated the action with another electric pulse, it happened again. The time displayed on the clock now read 7:52 p.m. For a second time in a row, he had somehow moved back in time by 10 minutes. By adjusting the voltage of the pulse, Paul found the amount of time that he was displaced back in time was roughly proportional to the strength of the pulse. At that point, Paul stopped his planned tests. Methodically logging his results and describing his experiences, he took pictures of his testing apparatus and left the lab. He decided that further investigation of this phenomenon was too important for him to investigate on his own. More than any other members of his team, he appreciated the potential dangers of his discovery if his initial findings proved to be true. These included temporal paradoxes, causality loops, quantum-level discontinuities, and the destructive distortion of temporal manifolds. No, he needed to be careful. Before he performed any other tests, he would need witnesses and other scientists to confirm what appeared to be happening. Paul's distress was so great that he did not even mention the incident to his wife and could not sleep at all. He laid awake all night, trying to figure out what his course of action should be in the morning, and what the implications of this discovery might be. Arriving early at the lab the next morning, Paul sat at his workstation calmly staring at the apparatus as he waited for his fellow scientists. The first one to arrive was the department head, Dr. Charles Dickerman. Charles wasn't nearly as technologically astute as any of the other scientists in the department, but he sheltered his staff from the vagaries of politics, funding, and the associated bureaucracy of the lab, allowing everyone to work without unwanted interruptions. Paul decided to wait for one of the other lead investigators to arrive before talking to Dickerman. The next person to show up was Stan Cohen, a serious but gentle fellow who was one of the finest researchers on the team. With great care, Paul explained to both of them what had happened the night before and showed them both his engineering journal and photographs he had made. At first, they both stared at him incredulously. He even offered to repeat the experiment for them, but both Dr. Dickerman and Dr. Cohen simultaneously shouted, "No." "If what you say is true," explained Stan, "we need to proceed with extreme caution. We will, of course, need to repeat your experiments, but only in carefully controlled environments, and with a full suite of measurement and diagnostic equipment. We also need credible witnesses to document what happens." Paul nodded. It is exactly what he had expected, and he agreed. The rest of the staff was briefed as they arrived. Together, they all spent the morning designing experiments to evaluate or verify Paul's observations. The first series of tests on inanimate objects, however, failed. With everyone standing well back from Paul's apparatus, nothing seemed to happen when the triggering electrical pulse was generated. The objects near the test device did not disappear, nor did they seem to be displaced in time at all. Paul suggested that the phenomenon might only work on people, adding that the complexity of the human nervous system might somehow resonate with the nearby liquid crystal matrix. To find out, he volunteered to repeat the experiment with himself as the test subject, but his colleagues stopped him once more. Everyone wanted more controlled experiments if they were going to include live test subjects. Dr. Dickerman reported the situation to his superiors, and their lab was immediately secured and all work classified, at least until definitive results were achieved. Several of the senior division directors also showed up to oversee these experiments. By the time Dickerman finally approved and authorized the tests, it was well after lunch. For the live test run, Stan planned to place Paul in a metal soundproof booth that had been used in other experiments earlier that year. Rather than tampering with Paul's original apparatus, they built a new one and hoped to reproduce the 10-minute temporal displacement Paul had reported. Not everyone thought the experiments would work. Several of the attending scientists doubted Paul's story and whispered about him being unreliable when they thought he couldn't hear. The rest of the afternoon was spent setting up sensors, video recorders, and telemetry equipment. Finally, it appeared they were ready to proceed. "Are you certain we should proceed?" asked Dickerman. "Absolutely," answered Stan. "If there is the slightest chance Paul's discovery is true, we have to try to repeat his results. If he could move back 10 minutes in time, who knows how far we could go if we used more power on a larger liquid crystal matrix. Even the slightest success would be monumental." "So we're ready," said Dickerman. "Yes, I can't think of anything else we could possibly measure. We have electromagnetic sensors for light, radio waves, IR, UV, thermal sensors, and gravimetric detectors. We have devices to measure vibration, sound, and pressure that are so sensitive they could detect an ant fart." Everyone laughed, but the tension remained almost palpable. Paul entered the soundproof chamber, and 2 technicians immediately began hooking him up to biometric measurement equipment. After a couple of minutes, he had so many wires attached to him that it made a polygraph look simple. They planned to measure brainwaves, heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductivity, every imaginable biometric they could think of. When they were finally done, they started video cameras to record the test. As he closed the door, Stan whispered softly, "Paul, you do realize that if this doesn't work, we're all going to be in big trouble. Right now, people believe you based on your reputation, but if this fails, no one will likely ever believe anything you say again." Paul's mouth grew dry, and he nodded. Finally, as he sat in the tiny chamber, he stared at the small shelf in front of him and the small digital clock that displayed the time in hours, minutes, and seconds. The current time was 3:45 p.m. The test pulse would be triggered at exactly 4 p.m. As he waited, the team rechecked everything from outside. However, through the soundproofed walls of the capsule, Paul couldn't hear anything, and he simply had to wait. The 15-minute wait seemed far longer than it really was. Using an intercom, Paul talked to the people outside through an intercom built into the capsule. He even managed to joke a little with his fellow researchers. Finally, as the clock approached the top of the hour, Paul silently counted down the remaining seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then there was the tiniest flash of light, and Paul blinked, glancing down at the clock. He held his breath for a moment when he noted that it now read 3:47 p.m. The test had worked. Just like the previous night, he had gone back 13 minutes in time. Using the intercom, Paul shouted, reporting success. Stan replied, saying, "Paul, be quiet and stop horsing around. We haven't even hooked up power to the apparatus yet." "But it worked," insisted Paul. While everyone seemed surprised, they stopped and rewound the videotapes. However, they failed to show that anything had happened. The video showed Paul sitting quietly in his seat, but there was no physical evidence that anything had occurred. "That's not funny," chastised Stan. "Stop pranking us and sit still." Paul could tell from the sound in everyone's voice that people outside were starting to get angry with him, so he bit his tongue and stayed quiet. Once again, he waited and watched the clock until it reached 4 p.m. Finally, exactly at the top of the hour, he saw a tiny flash of light, and Paul found himself back at 3:47 p.m. once more. Activating the intercom, he explained that the experiment had worked, but as before, he was chastised for joking around. This time, however, he gave up more easily and laughed, as if he had just been kidding. The experiment repeated itself a third time. Again, the time on Paul's clock had changed from 4 p.m. to 3:47 p.m. Paul endured the test a fourth time, but it seemed that no matter how many times he let them repeat the experiment, the same thing happened, and no one believed him that the experiment had worked. Finally, after the fifth replay of the test, Paul concluded that this scenario was just going to keep repeating itself, and no one was ever going to believe him. Paul unhooked himself from the wires that were attached to him, determined to stop this idiocy. This was going to go on forever if he didn't stop it. Thinking quickly, he chose the first excuse that came to mind, opened the door of the booth, and stepped out. "I'm sorry," he exclaimed. "I've never told anyone this, but I'm quite claustrophobic and can't bear to be in that tiny chamber a single second more." Several of his colleagues laughed loudly, and Paul looked down, embarrassed. Stan made an exaggerated gesture of dismay and said, "Now you tell us," laughing perhaps a little too loudly. Fortunately, everyone else laughed too. Dr. Dickerman looked around and finally asked, "Does that mean we're going to call this off?" People stared at one another in silence for a moment, until another tech named Ellis loudly said, "Hell, if no one else is game, I'll do it. Come on, hook me up." Everyone stared at Ellis Longmore, who had a reputation for being something of a goof-off. While he was a brilliant statistician, he was a jokester, and he had probably been the class clown in college. No one took him very seriously, since he always made wisecracks at the wrong times. Stan glanced at Dr. Dickerman, who simply nodded. "Sure, Ellis," said Stan. "You can replace Paul. We'll get you set up and reschedule the test for 4:30. Then everyone swarmed around Ellis, who beamed with pride at finally being the center of attention for the whole team. Paul stepped slowly to the rear of the crowd and watched, wondering what would happen now. As he studied the crowd of scientists and engineers, he tried to figure out what had happened. He was certain that he had traveled back in time, but everyone denied it, and even the videotapes failed to show any physical displacement. For a moment, he considered that he might be delusional, but he shook his head, certain that somehow he had moved exactly 13 minutes backward in time. Glancing at the crowd surrounding the heavily walled chamber, he was grateful that Ellis had managed to break the tension in the room with his antics. He had earned a reputation for telling jokes when he should be serious, but this time he was outdoing himself. They had nearly a half hour until the next scheduled test, but Ellis was apparently not willing to spend them quietly. After entering the small soundproof capsule, Ellis joked over the intercom that the experiment had worked and that he had just come back from ancient Egypt, where he had supervised the building of the pyramids. People laughed, but that only encouraged Ellis even more. After non-stop gaffes, they finally turned the intercom down and told him to be quiet. Then Ellis opened the door to the booth and leaned out of the chamber. The first time, he loudly demanded a new seat in first class, and a few minutes later, he again opened the hatch to complain about his in-flight meal. Finally, Stan chastised him, saying, "Stop it, Ellis. I mean it. We need to baseline your biometrics, so just sit still until the test begins." Then, Stan locked the chamber door from the outside. There was a general sigh of relief, as the team could now proceed without interruption. Paul took a step forward and then stopped himself. With the door locked, Paul wasn't certain whether or not Ellis would not be able to leave the chamber if the test repeated itself like it had for him. But he didn't want to interrupt the proceedings again and wondered what would happen now. The room grew quiet, and Paul stayed back at the edge of the crowd, nervous because people would periodically look at him and whisper as they shook their heads. Finally, the time of the test approached. As the clock approached 1/2 the hour, Paul counted down the seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A technician flipped the switch, but nothing happened. Turning the intercom back on, Stan asked Ellis if anything had happened, but there was no reply. Then someone reached over and unlocked the chamber door. Peeking through the doorway, Paul could see Ellis calmly sitting in his seat, telemetry wires all hooked up and in place. However, he didn't move. Finally, Stan came over and poked him. "Come on, Ellis, stop clowning around." Then, leaning close, Stan examined him more closely. After a moment, he turned and whispered to Dr. Dickerman that Ellis was dead. Everyone gasped in horror, and slowly, everyone turned and glared at Paul. The rest of the day was a blur. EMTs were called and arrived after long minutes. They moved Ellis to an open area of the floor and tried unsuccessfully for more than 20 minutes to revive him. The team reviewed the videotapes, but they simply showed Ellis sitting peacefully in his seat. It was past 8 p.m. that night before the body was removed and everyone sent home. Security personnel then locked and secured the lab. Later that evening, Dr. Dickerman called Paul and told him that the lab would be closed until after the weekend, while the details of what had occurred were reviewed and documented. Over the next 3 days, Paul thought heavily on the matter and finally decided that he knew what had happened. Paul had decided that, when the temporal displacement device had been activated, he had not physically been sent back in time. Rather, it was just his consciousness, his awareness, that had moved to an earlier moment. If he was correct, that would mean that Ellis's consciousness had similarly been sent back 13 minutes in time. However, with the intercom turned off and the door locked, Ellis would not have been able to contact the team outside. Therefore, as Ellis remained trapped in the chamber, the time would have advanced until it was once again 4:30 p.m., when the device would trigger and send him back again. Then, after 13 more subjective minutes inside the chamber, it would have sent him back again, and then again. Essentially, Ellis had been locked in a soundproofed box and caught up in a temporal loop from which he could not escape. While Paul had exited the chamber, Ellis had been trapped and had kept getting sent back to relive the previous 13 minutes over and over again. Paul shuddered. There was no way to know how many times Ellis had experienced that repeating loop. It could have been dozens, hundreds, or thousands of times. Paul worried and wondered how many times the human mind could endure endlessly reliving the same 13 minutes. It could have been millions of times. Ellis would have been trapped in a body that did not age, repeating those same minutes endlessly. He might have survived for many subjective days or even years. Despite the repetition, he would never have grown hungry. He would never have wanted water or air. Indeed, he might have been trapped in that loop for millennia. In the end, while nothing physically would have happened to Ellis's body, his mind probably reached some kind of limit, and finally, he died. While the temporal displacement device had only fired once, it had been sufficient to create an infinite loop from which there was no escape. Paul squeezed his eyes tightly and shuddered at the thought of how horrible it must have been to die that way. When Paul returned to the lab after the weekend, he arrived to see construction teams removing equipment, the booth, the measurement equipment, and anything related to the work on PCLC-20. Dr. Dickerman assembled everyone and explained that Ellis had apparently died of a heart attack while in the booth. He further explained that all projects had been canceled and that the lab was going to be repurposed. Everyone would be transferred to other departments, but it would take a few days to reassign everyone. Until then, everyone was invited to work on personal projects, catch up on reading technical journals or research papers, or even take some personal time off. However, he told everyone that all work on Paul's project was expressly forbidden. Everyone left, but no one said a word to Paul, not even Dr. Dickerman. Paul went and sat at his personal workstation and just stared at the original device he had built. He couldn't seem to turn his mind to anything else. After an hour, he slowly began to disassemble the apparatus that had started all this trouble. Then, he started building a much smaller version of the device. Actually, it was pretty simple. He took the large gold stopwatch that he always carried. He had gotten it from his father when he graduated from college. Carefully removing the mechanical innards, he replaced them with the much smaller electrical movement from his wristwatch. Then, he filled the empty space with a tiny reservoir of the PCLC-20 liquid crystal that he had started with and added a small battery and a capacitor. It only took him about an hour to reconstruct his device inside that large gold watch. Examining it, he estimated that the smaller device would only hold enough charge for a single pulse of temporal energy, and that any resultant temporal displacement would be much less than before, probably less than a minute. After he finished, he remained on his stool and stared at the watch for the longest time, wondering if this was the right thing to do. Finally, he got up and headed to Dr. Dickerman's office. Slowly opening the door, he entered and showed the lab chief the gold watch. Then he proceeded to explain what he had built. However, before he could finish, Dr. Dickerman exploded with rage. "Are you insane, Paul? Didn't you hear me when I told everyone that they were to stop entertaining this crazy idea of yours? Don't you get it? It doesn't work, and it unfortunately led to the death of Dr. Longmore. As a result, I'm liable to lose my position for having entertained your outlandish claim. To be honest, we were all just humoring you. No one thought you had really discovered a method to travel in time, but Stan and a couple of others thought enough of you to at least test it out. Stan resigned over the weekend and has taken a job over at JPL. I'll likely be demoted, and you you are probably going to be out of a job completely. No other department's going to want you, and after word gets around, no other institution will even touch you. You would have spent the rest of your days with nowhere to go and nothing to do. But now, by directly disobeying an order, I can have you fired immediately. You're finished, Paul. You should have retired last year when you had the chance, before your senile lunatic notions destroyed your reputation. Why, you'll be lucky if... Paul's fingers tightened, and he unintentionally squeezed down on the stem of the watch, clicking it. There was a tiny flash of light, and Paul found himself in front of Dr. Dickerman's desk, holding up the watch he had just built. Blinking, he realized he had returned to the moment when he was explaining what he'd done to Dr. Dickerman, just before Dr. Dickerman's tirade. Then he clicked the watch again, and then again, each time returning to the moment, perhaps 15 seconds earlier than the moment before. Finally, Paul found himself back on his stool by his workstation, holding the watch loosely in his hand. For a moment, he was surprised that he could have used the watch so many times in a row. It couldn't have held that much of a charge. Then he realized that whenever he used it, he moved back to a time before he had clicked the watch. He laughed, with the realization that the watch would always contain just one charge, no matter how many times he clicked the stopwatch. Looking up, he glanced toward the lab chief's office, noting that his most recent conversation with Dr. Dickerman had not yet occurred. Then he reflected on the things Charles had said to Paul and thought about how it should have played out differently. Smiling, he stood up and strode into Dickerman's office. The lab chief looked up from his desk as Paul addressed him. "You know, Charles, this is all your fault. You and Stan are the ones that got Ellis killed. Neither of you believed me when I told you the device worked. And then, when you locked Ellis in that booth, you sentenced him to an infinite time loop that repeated until his mind died. The real problem is that you haven't the technical competence to lead this team. It's people like me and Stan that made this department work. We've been successful not because of you, but rather in spite of you. You know what? It's appropriate that the team is being dispersed and that you won't be in charge anymore. With me and Stan gone, your failure around here would have just been too grandiose, and you would have likely destroyed more careers than your own." Charles' face grew red, and he stood, apparently ready to explode. But Paul raised his hand, saying, "No, don't even try to think of a comeback. I'm really not interested in anything you have to say. I just wanted to get all this off my chest and let you know that I've always thought of you as a failure and a political hack." Then, smiling proudly, Paul clicked his stopwatch over and over again until he was sitting once more on the stool of his workstation. Sighing deeply, Paul reflected that his little interchange with Dickerman had been quite satisfying, but he had to admit it wasn't a practical solution to the problem he faced. After thinking some more, he stood and slowly walked to Dr. Dickerman's doorway, softly knocking on his door jamb. Charles looked up and motioned Paul to enter. With only the smallest hint of hesitation, Paul said, "I'm sorry to disturb you, Dr. Dickerman, but I wanted you to know that I've given the recent events here a lot of thought, and I somehow feel responsible for some of what happened here. Oh, I know I didn't cause Ellis's heart attack, but his death occurred investigating something that we were never able to duplicate." Paul paused, and Dr. Dickerman opened his mouth to say something, but Paul hurriedly continued. "No, let me finish. Like I said, I'd been thinking, and I think it's time I took you up on that offer you made me last year. I mean, the opportunity to retire. Perhaps it's time for me to let all of this go. After all, I'll have a full pension, and it's probably overdue for me to stop working here. I just don't want to hang around here after all that's happened. I hope you'll understand." Lowering his eyes, as if in shame, Paul gave Dickerman a moment to absorb what he had said. Finally, Charles said, "That's quite thoughtful of you, Paul. You're well respected and have a reputation as one of the top scientists here at the lab. But you may be right. Things could be awkward here for a while, and I think you're right to consider retiring. If you don't mind, I'll talk to HR and some of the division directors and see if I can help that occur. Would that be all right?" Paul nodded silently. Charles Dickerman grinned, as if he were enjoying a private victory. "Great," he said. "I'll see what I can do and let you know." Paul nodded again and left the lab chief's office. Then he returned to his workstation and cleaned out his desk, taking only his lab notebooks, a few personal items, and his favorite gold watch. On the way home, Paul thought about how to break the news of his sudden termination at the lab to his wife, Margaret. Then, as he reflected on it, he decided that she'd probably be delighted. She'd been wanting him to retire for years. However, while Margaret always wanted to travel and take some cruises to exotic locations, Paul decided that for a while he'd like to continue his experiments and research. Once he had refined his method for moving backward in time, he would be able to patent it, and he could make a fortune. Why, if he made more of these watches, he could sell them for millions of dollars each. Then, as he drove home, other fanciful ideas occurred to him. Paul found himself daydreaming about other ways he could use the watch. Why, he could take it to the local casino at the edge of town and play high-stakes poker. He could play a hand, and when he had learned what everyone's cards were, he would be able to reset time and replay that hand over again. That way, he'd know when people had a winning hand and when they were bluffing. He'd know when to raise and when to fold. Smiling, he imagined how much money he could make that way. Why, it would be more than enough to fund his research. Of course, he could never tell anyone about the watch until he was ready. He wouldn't even be able to tell Margaret. No, all of this would have to remain completely secret until he had everything in place to go public. As his mind raced, innumerable plans and schemes came to mind, and for a moment he wasn't sure what he should do. Then he laughed and realized that he didn't have to make a decision right then. After all, he had all the time in the world. Thank you for listening. We love our listeners, fans, and patrons here at Untold Tales, and we would love to hear from you. Please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, letting us know what your favorite story has been in our 3 seasons of storytelling so far. We'd love to continue shaping our podcast with stories that you'd like to hear. As always, thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.